It started not with a bang or a whimper, but with a quiet little lie told on the evening news. That's how the end of everything always begins, isn't it? Not with honest, apocalyptic thunder, but with the gentle, reassuring murmur of a well-paid news anchor telling you not to believe your own eyes. I remember the night perfectly. I was sitting in my worn-out armchair, the one with the permanent impression of my body moulded into its faded chintz. A half-eaten microwave dinner sat beside me, congealing on the plate while I nursed a lukewarm beer. Outside, the crickets were soaring away at the August humidity. It was a Tuesday. Just a regular, forgettable Tuesday. The kind that forms the bland bedrock of life. On the TV, a man with teeth too white and a tie too red was smiling a practiced, calming smile. His name was Chet Marlowe. "Astronomers are baffled tonight by a rare atmospheric phenomenon," he chirped, his voice smooth as polished marble. "An unusual concentration of high-altitude dust, likely from a series of recent volcanic eruptions in the South Pacific, is causing some minor observational distortions in the night sky." He gestured to a graphic over his shoulder. It showed a blurry section of the sky, a familiar quadrant where the constellation Orion should have been brandishing his celestial sword. But in the image, Orion was missing his belt. The three iconic stars were just gone. The graphic was labelled atmospheric obscuration. I frowned, swirling the dregs of my beer. I wasn't an astronomer, just a guy who designed user interfaces for a soul-crushingly dull software company. But I'd been a kid once. A kid with a cheap telescope and a dog-eared book of constellations. I knew Orion's belt. You couldn't just misplace Orion's belt. It was like misplacing the Grand Canyon. "Experts assure us this is a temporary event," Chet continued, that flawless smile never wavering. "The dust is expected to dissipate over the next few weeks, returning our beautiful night sky to its pristine state." I got up, my knees cracking a protest, and walked to the sliding glass door that led to my small, overgrown backyard. My house was just far enough from the city's luminous haze to offer a decent view of the heavens. I slid the door open, the humid air instantly clinging to my skin, and stepped onto the damp grass. I looked up. The lie on the TV was stark and immediate. This wasn't at all what they were saying. It was a void. Where the three bright jewels of Orion's belt should have been, there was an unnerving, absolute blackness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was an active, consuming emptiness. The surrounding stars seemed to shrink away from it, their ancient lights looking feeble and terrified. It was a patch of anti-sky, a hole punched through the very fabric of the cosmos. A wound. A shiver, cold and sharp despite the heat, traced a path down my spine. I felt a sudden, profound sense of vertigo, as if I was standing on the edge of an infinite cliff. My beer bottle slipped from my suddenly numb fingers and thudded softly onto the lawn. I didn't notice. I couldn't look away from the hole where a legend used to be. The next few weeks came and went. The lie got bigger. First, it was entire constellations. The Pleiades, the beautiful Seven Sisters, vanished overnight. One evening, they were a shimmering cluster, a tiny, exquisite diamond against the velvet black. The next, there was nothing. Just more of that deep, perfect, horrifying emptiness. Government-funded astronomers, their faces pale and their eyes haunted on news interviews, kept talking about unprecedented atmospheric lensing and magnospheric interference. They used big, complicated words that sounded important but meant nothing. They were orchestra conductors trying to lead a symphony with a broken baton, while the theatre burned down around them. The public, for a while, bought it. We wanted to believe it. The alternative was simply too monstrous to contemplate. We'd go to work, pay our bills, complain about traffic, and try very hard not to look up at night. The sky became a source of collective anxiety, a celestial horror we all agreed not to talk about at parties. Looking up felt like staring into an open grave. But the universe, it seemed, was not interested in our denial. The disappearances accelerated. Polaris, the North Star, the linchpin of the northern sky, the one constant that had guided travellers for millennia, winked out of existence on a Tuesday in October. Its absence was a physical blow. The sky felt unmoored, adrift. The next morning, the world woke up feeling different. The change was subtle, an uncanny shift in the very texture of reality. The sunlight seemed thinner, the colours of the world a little less saturated. A quiet, persistent hum of dread began to thrum just beneath the surface of everyday life. That's when the chaos started its slow, inexorable creep into our lives. People noticed. You can't hide the death of the heavens forever. Amateur astronomers with their own telescopes started posting frantic, terrified videos online. Their observatories, once portals to wonder, had become windows into an unravelling nightmare. They showed images of gaping black voids where entire galaxies should have been. The lies from the authorities became more desperate, more absurd. Solar flares, a previously unknown type of cosmic cloud, a computer glitch in the global satellite imaging network. No one was buying it anymore. The fear began to curdle into something uglier. Panic. I saw it first at the grocery store. A woman dropped a carton of eggs. Instead of just cleaning it up, she started screaming, a raw sound of pure terror. She pointed a trembling finger at the fluorescent lights above. "They're next," she shrieked. "They're turning them all off." People didn't laugh or move away. They just stared, their own silent panic reflected in their wide eyes. The sound of the refrigerators sounded, for a moment, like a funeral dirge. Religious fervour exploded. Street corner prophets who had been ignored for years suddenly drew massive crowds. Their apocalyptic ravings now sounding chillingly plausible. They claimed it was the rapture, that the stars were the souls of the righteous being plucked from the firmament. Others declared it was God's wrath, a divine closing of the curtains on a sinful world. Cults sprang up overnight, promising secret knowledge, celestial escape, or at the very least, a coherent explanation for the insanity. Then came the simulationists. They were almost worse. They argued with a chilling, academic calm that we were merely living in a complex program and the system was shutting down. The stars weren't disappearing. They were being de-rendered to save processing power. Our reality was a cosmic computer screen being turned off, pixel by pixel. The idea was so cold, so impersonal, that it was somehow more terrifying than a wrathful God. It meant that our lives, our loves, our fears, none of it was real. We were just lines of code in a program that was about to be deleted. By Christmas, the night sky was a sparse, terrifying canvas. Only the brightest, most stubborn stars remained, looking lonely and exposed in the encroaching darkness. People stopped celebrating. What was the point of hanging festive lights when the grand eternal lights of the universe were being extinguished? The world grew dimmer, not just at night, but in spirit. Then, on a frigid night in late January, the last star went out. It was Vega in the constellation Lyra. I watched it go from my backyard, huddled in a thick coat. It didn't flicker. It didn't fade. It was just there one moment, a brilliant blue-white spark, and gone the next. The silence it left behind was deafening. For months, the night belonged only to the moon. It hung in that starless, abyssal sky, like a solitary pearl on black velvet. A final, defiant beacon. People clung to it. The moon became a symbol of hope, of persistence. Its familiar cratered face was the only thing left that made sense in a world that had tilted off its axis. Lunar calendars became more important than Gregorian ones. People held moon-watching festivals, gathering in fields to stare up at that last celestial companion, their faces bathed in its pale, silvery light. They told themselves that as long as the moon was there, everything would be okay. It was another lie, of course, the biggest one of all. Last night, the moon disappeared, and this morning, the droning began. The droning wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, not at first. It was a pressure in your sinuses, a vibration in your teeth. It was the lowest possible note on a cello the size of a mountain, played by a malevolent god. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. A foundational hum that seemed to issue from the very atoms of the air. When I woke that first morning to the starless, moonless dark, it was already there, waiting. It had woven itself into the fabric of the world while we slept. The true nature of the sound became apparent when I went to the window. In the pre-dawn gloom, the world outside was a landscape of grey shapes and deep shadows. And the droning was louder out there. It wasn't a single, monotonous tone. It was complex, layered with harmonics that felt jagged and wrong in my ears. It scraped at the edges of my hearing, a dissonant chord that promised to unravel everything. The chaos began with the sirens. A few at first, then more. Their frantic, rising and falling wails, weaving in and out of the constant drone. They sounded thin and pathetic against that monolithic hum. Then came the shouting. My neighbour, a quiet man named Mr. Henderson, who spent his weekends caring for his lawn, was standing in the middle of the street in his pyjamas. He was screaming at the sky, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He wasn't using words. just animalistic howls of fury, as if he could intimidate the emptiness into returning what it had stolen. I locked my doors. I drew my blinds. My small suburban house, once a place of simple, boring comfort, became a fortress. A submarine in an ocean of encroaching madness. The droning was my constant companion. It seeped through the walls, vibrated up through the floorboards. I tried to block it out with music from my phone's library, but the cheerful pop songs and sweeping classical pieces sounded grotesque and hollow, like a child's laughter in a graveyard. The drone bled through everything, twisting the melodies into something mocking and sinister. The days that followed blurred into a single, continuous nightmare defined by sound. The world outside was a symphony of collapse. I heard gunshots, sporadic at first, then in bursts. I heard the shattering of glass, the splintering of wood. I heard screams, so many screams. Screams of pain, of fear, and most disturbingly, screams of what sounded like ecstatic joy. The drone was working on people, prying open the fragile doors of their sanity and letting the monsters out. The television was useless, a dead monolith. The radio hissed with white noise, but sometimes, through the electronic snow, I could catch fragments of voices, broken and terrified. A military broadcast imposing a curfew that no one was enforcing. A preacher speaking in tongues, his voice rising to a fever pitch before being cut off by a burst of static that sounded like a scream. A calm, female voice, likely from an emergency broadcast system, repeating the same meaningless phrase over and over. Remain indoors. Avoid looking at the sky. The phenomenon is. It's always cut out there. I lived on canned soup and crackers, rationing my bottled water. The hunger and thirst were distant, secondary concerns. The real battle was against the sound. It was an acid, slowly dissolving my thoughts. It made it hard to concentrate, to remember simple things. I'd find myself standing in the middle of the living room, unsure of how I got there or what I'd intended to do. The drone was always there, a buzzing, insistent question mark at the end of every thought. What's happening? Why is it happening? Am I going mad? One afternoon, I risked a peek through the blinds. The world had become primal. A small group of people were gathered around a bonfire in the middle of the street, feeding it with their neighbours' furniture. They were dancing, their movements convulsive, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They weren't celebrating. They were worshipping the sound, giving themselves over to it. One of them saw me, a pale face in a dark window. He pointed, his mouth opening in a wide, silent O of discovery. I dropped the blind in a panic. I spent the rest of the day huddled in the pantry, listening to them occasionally bump and scrape against the outside of my house. The drone changed. After what I guessed was a week, it began to develop a pulse, a cosmic pulse, the heartbeat of the thing that had eaten the sky. It was intimate. It felt like it was inside me, that my own heart was now beating in time with the end of the world. That was the worst part. It wasn't just an external pressure anymore. It was becoming part of me. I lost track of time. Day was a period of dim, grey light. Night was an absolute, suffocating blackness, a blindfold on the universe. My world shrank to the four walls of my house and the landscape of my own fraying mind. I started talking to myself, my voice sounding alien and loud in the droning silence between my ears. I argued with the simulationists, with the prophets, with Chet Marlowe and his perfect lying teeth. I told them they were all wrong. This wasn't a system shutdown. This wasn't God's anger. It was something new. Something that had been waiting, patiently, in the black spaces between the stars, and had finally finished clearing the table before it sat down to its meal. And then it stopped. The silence was so sudden, so total, that I cried out, clapping my hands over my ears as if to protect them from a deafening explosion. The absence of the drone was a void more profound than the starless sky. For weeks, it had been the entire world, the texture of my existence. Now, there was nothing. I stood in the centre of my living room, trembling, every nerve ending screaming. I waited for the chaos to rush back in and fill the vacuum. The screams, the sirens, the crackle of fires. But not a single sound. Not the wind in the trees, because there was no wind. Not the hum of a distant engine. Not the cry of a bird. Not a human voice. The symphony of madness outside my door had ended. The entire orchestra had simply vanished. The silence was the final horror. The noise had been a presence, something to fight against, something that proved the world, however insane, still existed. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in the middle of the room. Maybe an hour, maybe a day. Time had lost its meaning. But a new feeling was beginning to grow in the pit of my stomach, overriding the terror. A dreadful, inexorable curiosity. What was outside? What did a world without sound look like? What had the drone done? And what came after? Slowly, like a man moving underwater, I walked to the front door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. The metal was cold, inert. I turned the deadbolt. The click was an obscene violation of the perfect stillness. A gunshot ringing out in the library. I paused, my ear pressed against the wood, listening to the sound of nothing outside. There was only one way to know. I took a deep breath, and I opened the door.